Hey, everybody, and welcome back. So today I'm just going to answer another round of your questions. From time to time, I'll throw up a community post saying, hey, ask whatever you want, and people respond with questions for me, and I answer them in a video. So here we are. If you ever want to get in on that, just look for community posts. I'll put them up from time to time. I usually leave them for a couple weeks or so, so if you're checking my page every so often, you should be able to see and get on that if you want to. Also, if you want to sign up for my Patreon, I give patrons first go and make sure to answer their questions first. So, there's always that. Make sure to give responsibly. I don't want people giving me money that they can't afford. But I just think these things are a lot of fun. They never get a ton of views, but it's a great way for us to get to know each other. Obviously, I reveal things about myself and how I answer the questions, whether I do so in a serious or a silly way. But also, I feel like I get to know you all a little bit based on the questions you ask. They tell me a little bit about what you're thinking and what you want to know about me. So it's all great fun. No patrons asked any questions this time. So I'm just going to go straight through and answer the questions from the community posts in order. I'm going to start with the extracurricular one. That's an arbitrary choice, but I kind of feel like the people who are there might be the ones who know me a little bit better and, follow a little more closely. But in the end, I'm going to get through all of them. I'm also going to throw in it's just a random thing, some pictures I've taken when I've been hiking lately. Probably every other day I'll go on short, hour to two hikes, just to take advantage of the summer up here in Alaska. So I'll share those just really quickly, just to break it up a little bit and show you a little bit more about what I've been up to. Anyway, let's start with the questions here. First, from the human Tommy, what kind of music are you into? I'm not really much of a music person. I don't know why that is. Partly it might just be my personality. I sometimes put it to the fact that I was never allowed to listen to anything other than Christian music. And even then, they were picky about what kind of Christian music was worshipful enough and God-centered enough to be appropriate to listen to. And that might have taken away my desire for music or whatever, or stopped me from developing a taste for it. But honestly, I think it's partly just not in my personality. I have gotten into some music, you can't help but encounter on the internet, whether it's little bits of things you find when you're scrolling through social media or whatever. But I guess I don't really have a specific taste. I just latch on to certain kinds of songs and I get a little interested in them for a bit. One type of song I've gotten into is kind of, I guess you'd call them protest songs. So I enjoy Arrest the President. There's The Coop. I like a lot of their music. Let's see. There's one, I think Bryan Adams is his name. He's a country singer. He looks super, super hillbilly and MAGA, but he's very militantly the opposite of that. He did a song called Yeehaw that I like. What else? Oh, there's You're Next. I can't remember who sings that one, but it's about how if you think you're happy that ICE is rounding up people, soon it'll be you. So that kind of stuff I enjoy because, it's me and that's where I feel like my mind's at right now. Also, one problem I have is I can get into sentimental music and other things like that. And this might get to one reason I'm not really a ton into music is I like to think I'm an introspective person and I have a lot of thoughts going around in my head. But one problem is if I spend too much time by myself with my thoughts, I start to loop and go places that are unpredictable and I don't always want to go. And so I guess this is a little window into me in a little bit of my vulnerabilities. I don't feel like I have a lot. I feel like I'm usually pretty okay as a person. But one thing I do to self-regulate is I don't just sit there and listen to a lot of kinds of music because my mind just starts going places and I'm inside with myself too much. And I don't know that's a good thing for me. So that's why instead of music, often I'll listen to things like podcasts or things that have a certain amount of direction to them, or that I can just, focus on ideas instead of just sitting there having my emotions turned up by music. So sorry, that's probably not a super good answer. Music isn't super my thing, but hopefully how I answer this tells you something about me all the same. Next, was there an ambition in life that you had to let go of for any reason, but were able to pick back up later? Yeah, I would say this is definitely the case for me. Basketball is one thing I'd let go of. I don't think I picked it up much, but I've started shooting from time to time if I'm at the gym and I have the time, but I'll probably never pick that up the way I did before. One big thing I would say is just writing. Writing is something that takes a lot of time and energy, and you really have to get yourself into a headspace to do it. And that had come in waves. When you have young kids or other things going on in life, it's really hard to keep that going. So that came and fell by the wayside. And I haven't written in the sense of writing like books or stories in quite a while. but YouTube has become a really great outlet for my writing itch. So I can scratch that by, just scripting out videos and stuff like that. A huge amount of the workload for my YouTubing is just writing every lunch break at work. And then when I have the chance, otherwise, I'll be just basically working on writing out my ideas. So this one and some of the videos, even on my main channel, are more off the cuff, just based on rough outlines or just me speaking off the cuff. But the ones I put the most time into are my video essays. And so, yeah, I've really been able to pick up my writing, and I've written a ton more just in terms of volume, and I would say probably in quality in YouTubing than in other things. There are a couple of reasons for that. Number one, I have a built-in audience for this already. Number two, I think, the internet is just how people consume stuff, especially in some kind of performed video format or audio format versus actually sitting down and reading. So whether we think that's a good thing or a bad thing, that's where the audience is. And so I've made a lot more of a thing out of essentially being a writer, even though I perform it on video, than I'd ever thought I would have. So it's been pretty cool. And also, just to say it explicitly, I really appreciate that you're all here and making this into a thing. It's been pretty awesome. If I recall correctly, and yeah, I had to look that up because I don't know what all these abbreviations mean. You are very knowledgeable about the Bible, and you are quite interested in ancient literature, e.g. Homer. I would love to know your thoughts on Julian Jaynes' hypothesis for the origin of human-specific consciousness as a mentality upgrade from an older cognitive framework where the hemispheres communicated as hallucinated ancestors and gods, as in modern schizophrenia. So when Athena drops in to give Hector new insight, that was, according to the theory, an archaic software version of human introspection. That's a lot of stuff that I'm not sure I 100% know about. Here's the thing. A lot of the ideas in this sound familiar to me, but whenever people bring up this person's theory or that person's theory, and I'm not saying this in a way that's meant to mock what you said or how you presented it, but I really don't always know the exact name of the theory or the person behind it that they're referring to. I am somewhat familiar, I think, with the raw ideas behind it. So whether that means I'm a poorly read person who just sits there and wings it on myself or what, I'm not sure. But I think I have some idea of a couple of the things you're talking about. One, it feels like you're referring to internal communication, basically people introspecting, or maybe like what I'd said in my answer to the question about music, sitting there looping in your own thoughts. And sometimes what you hear in your head can be taken for God, or at least you can convince yourself that it's God. I did that a lot and struggled to do that a lot when I was a Christian and trying to develop a prayer life. I would sit there and pray, and I would hear things pop up in my head, which I think was just me brainstorming, and consider that God. I don't know how this relates to different hemispheres or any form of schizophrenia. It could probably parallel aspects of schizophrenia where you, through practice or just instinct, think you're hearing thoughts that aren't your own. So yeah, I think there is definitely something interesting to be explored there. There are probably people doing it on a professional level and much more informed level than I ever will. But on a layperson's level, I think that's an interesting concept, especially as somebody who's experienced that. I've gotten a lot more in touch, I think, with what my thoughts are. As for the part about the gods in Homer, this is probably partly the same question, but I see it also having potential to go in a different direction, which is how that's communicated in the works of Homer. If you've been watching my Iliad videos, I definitely agree that Homer, I think, sees the gods in a somewhat metaphorical way. He seems to kind of be playing with the idea of them as non-literal things, whether that's forces of nature or, in this case, what's happening in somebody's mind. So almost every time a god comes down and speaks to a person, it does seem to be a reflection of their own thoughts or their own little flash of inspiration or courage or whatever. And I think it's just really interesting. It says a lot, I think, about who we are as people and how we develop inner dialogues, how we wrestle with our own, sense of self and maybe the multiple selves that there are inside of us, sometimes in contention. Also, I don't know, I think I'd said this when I talked about dealing with death and stuff like that, and the sense that somebody is still with you. Every person we interact with, whether they've passed or not, kind of remains with us as part of our own minds. Like that communication, I think we remember, and it remains meaningful to us as a recollection of that person. But I think it also kind of develops as a clump of ideas in our head. And so sometimes we can feel like we're communicating with that person when we interface with those thoughts inside of ourselves. I don't know if that makes any sense. But when that's relayed to us in religious terms, I think we can definitely feel like we're interacting with a God. And that's what can generate that maybe more involuntary sense of a God speaking to you, or of you feeling a sense that you need to obey that part of yourself, or maybe that you see it as more of a flash of inspiration than it really is. Or you take that inspiration, I guess, as being more divine and more absolutely correct. So yeah, I think there is a lot interesting here. Maybe I shouldn't keep going too far into it, because a lot of these things, when they catch my interest, can hijack the whole question and answer video. But yeah, I agree, and I think this is part of an interesting journey from religion to non-religion. Those instincts can do us good, but the more we understand what they are, we can still allow them to pop up in our head and we can still interact with them. But something about developing a growing awareness that they are just all our internal thoughts, and developing our skills in introspection without mistaking them for other things, I think they can only help us as people. And for me, it's been an interesting growing process, helped me think more clearly, and just helped me understand, honestly, the beauty of my own thoughts and how other people and ideas have contributed to them. So I don't know. I hope that answers your question. I feel like I meandered a little bit. Anyway, let's go on. As far as I know, you're still an atheist, which I highly respect. Well, thank you for your respect. However, I'm just curious, would you like there to be a God? Would you not like there to be a God? Or do you have mixed feelings, or do you not really care one way or the other? Looks like there's some other questions here, so I'll kind of pick through them one at a time. So I guess my first knee-jerk answer to this is I would not want there to be a God, and I'm glad there doesn't seem to be one. But really, it depends largely, I think, on the kind of God that we're talking about. If it were just a super loving God who could make things good for us and make us happy and, was inclined to do that, then sure, I could see some positive sides of that. If the God were malicious at all and harmed people and, was just as petty as a person would be, that could be pretty rough. I think one analogous question that could really help us understand this is, would you want to live in a universe that had some version of Superman in it? If the universe had, say, a Christopher Reeve Superman who was just nice and kind and basically a Boy Scout and just saved people, that could be really nice, and there could be a comfort in that. Even then, his character got corrupted, and that would just be a nightmare. But what if that character had the personality of Homelander? That wouldn't be so good. Basically, every moment would just be constant existential horror for all of us, and nobody would have any peace except, I guess, in their eventual death. And even if Superman were good, you might be wondering, what if he took a turn? What if, with so much of our well-being and happiness balancing on the decisions and moods and thoughts of one being, I'm not so sure that's a good thing. And so that's one reason that I would just generally say no. Another part of it is, even if the God were good and you could count on them to always be good, which, by the way, I think a lot of Christians say that is the case with their God. But in any real case with a real tangible God existing, I don't know that you could be that confident in that. Christians just tell themselves that that's the nature of God because that's what their theology says, and I think that makes them feel good about it. But I don't think that you could ever know that you would be happy with all the decisions that God was going to make. Okay, I'm getting a little off track here, but I just want to make this point. Christians say that God behaved a certain way in the Old Testament because that was a certain covenant, and that's, what he needed to do back then for whatever reason. What if God suddenly changed and started wanting to engage in conquests and executions and stuff like that today and told you to, participate in that? Would you like that? So even within Christian theology, if God took shifts back to what you thought he'd been in the past, I'm not sure people today would be at peace with that. But anyway, let's just say that God was totally good all the time, and all the time God was good. I feel like there's just something to having all of our answers and all of our hopes and dreams and everything about the universe boiled down to existing knowledge that someone else already had, that person could just, pass on wisdom to us. Everything's just wrapped up in that person. I don't know. And maybe morality is dictated by that being. There's something in that I just find, I don't know if nightmarish is too strong a word for it, but as I've become a non-believer and gotten my head around the idea of not believing in God over the past, 10 or so years, I've really started to appreciate the beauty in just discovering things for yourself. and not yourself as in one person. That can sound egotistical, and I know Christians would depict that as an egotistical, you want to be your own God thing. But yourself as a participant with other people, I don't think I'm so elevated that I'm going to figure everything out by myself, but as one person in one piece of the puzzle of humanity, doing what I can to figure things out, taking into account what everybody else has learned and integrating that into my own personal understanding of the world around me and who I am and how I should behave, and meeting very real obligations based on that. There's a journey there that I think is just pretty awesome and would be missing in large part if a God existed. So I don't know. It's hard to say. It would be such a shift in our thinking and so fundamentally change how we actually interface with reality and who we are as people. I don't know. We could totally get our heads around it, but I guess kind of like, being assimilated by the Borg, it would change so much of yourself that I kind of fear the possibility of myself changing that much and me essentially becoming a different person. And I just don't know that that would be good. So yeah, I guess I would come down on the not wanting there to be a God side of this. I'm also curious, do you have a favorite soda at all? I'm not a big soda drinker. I try generally not to drink calories just as a rule because most of them aren't that nutritious and it's just not good for you. Most time you distill things down into liquid calories. It ends up mostly being sugar, I guess, except milk. But if I had a favorite soda, it would probably be Coke Zero because it's not super sweet and it's, doesn't have sugar in it. And it tastes, it doesn't have that weird, diet soda taste to it. But yeah, I'm just not a big soda drinker. So sorry. I'm also curious if you have a preference between gas vehicles, diesel vehicles, electric vehicles, et cetera, at all. I'm not really sure. I guess I would lean toward electric just for environmental reasons. But even then, I'm not sure if electric vehicles are better for the environment or if, all the environmental damage happens at a power plant and then they pump it into your car and you just don't see the exhaust when you're driving. Maybe solar panels and wind energy and stuff like that could mitigate some of that. I guess I'd lean that way. In terms of my daily use, gas vehicles, because they seem to be, most affordable and readily available, and they operate fairly easily. Diesel vehicles, especially if you live when it's cold, from what I remember, I'm not an expert and I haven't driven a lot of them, but from what I remember of the times I've used diesel vehicles, getting the glow plugs to warm up and everything, especially in cold weather, isn't super fun and easy, and they're just noisy. So I don't know. I don't have a super strong opinion here, I guess. If I were to give my big picture opinion, if I were just in charge of changing the world at the snap of a finger, I'd say probably, if people walked and used bicycles more in walkable cities and also we use more public transportation, that'd probably be ideal. But yeah, I guess electric between the three for environmental reasons, if they're actually better environmentally. If you hadn't spent so much time on religious pursuits, what do you think you would have done with the time instead? This is a really interesting question, and it's kind of hard to answer because I'm not sure I really know how to quantify the amount of time I spent on religious pursuits, especially in isolation. So much of the time I spent on religious stuff, I think, is just general community and family time that I would have been doing roughly the same thing anyway, if that makes sense. I struggled a lot with really devoting myself to, daily Bible reading and prayer like most Christians. I went to church, so I don't know what I really would have done with that time otherwise, or, if I would have really made a lot of use of those couple hours a week. I taught some Sunday school and things like that, but I don't know if this really took a ton of my time. I was a Christian school principal, and that sure took a lot of my time, but that was a job too, so I probably just would have been at another job, not nearly as many hours as that one for the little pay. That's just the way Christian education goes. But I don't know, to be fully honest. A lot of my time when I was, younger and when I was deeply religious, I spent on a lot of time wasting things anyway, like maybe watching TV or just playing around with games and stuff. If I wasn't spending time with my family, which my kids were at an age there where I was spending a lot of time with them because I think parenting is really important and getting in time with your kids, investing in that. I think more than time, what religious pursuits and just religion in general took from me was mental space. It blocked a lot of my thinking from, more constructive, open-ended thought processes. and it stopped me from getting involved in, I think, maybe just opening new horizons and stuff like that. So that was probably the bigger effect it had on me. But you know, as much as it's easy to blame religion for things, and it's hard to tell how much of a role it played in your life and how much it affected you, I'm not sure in terms of time it really changed that much for me. So I don't know. Hard to say. Do you have an opinion about the new Odyssey movie Chris Nolan is doing since you're a fan of Homer? I ask because it's become a hot topic lately on the YouTube space. And I'm going to break form here and pull in a question from my regular channel's community page because they're essentially asking the same thing. And I'm just going to basically just, acknowledge and read them both and answer them together. Your impression on Nolan's upcoming Odyssey? Not really interested in the non-controversies around casting. Legit interested in your thoughts if you have any. I personally mostly enjoy his films, but I do worry that genre might not be in his wheelhouse. So I'm not sure I have an impression on this as such yet. I'm definitely interested in watching it. That's my main impression. I like Christopher Nolan's movies. I can see how people aren't really sure if the Odyssey is really going to be his thing. I've heard some people point out, and I can see this, that, Matt Damon, when he's coming home and everything, he looks too clean cut and non-weathered and everything to have just come off of a long Odyssey. And so they compare that to another movie, I think, called The Return. I think there are different things that people are potentially bothered by here. One is just how faithful it's going to be to Homer and stuff like that. And I can see how, with me being a little bit of a Greek mythology nerd and having taught it for a long time, that might be a concern of mine. But it's really not. Greek mythology, and Homer specifically, has proven so malleable over the years, and it's been made into things that reflect the current culture, whether that's just subconsciously or people are actually trying to subvert or update the material. And so I just look forward to seeing different versions of the stories and seeing what people do with them. And so, I don't know, I've seen tons of Greek mythology on film, a lot of it pretty bad, but I have a fascination with just seeing how different people play with it. And I look forward to seeing this one version of that. One of these questions mentioned not being interested in the casting controversy. Others mentioned the conversation on YouTube space, which largely is about that. And yeah, I don't know. I could see some of the casting choices that are at least rumored being a little bit weird, but I have a knee-jerk reaction because a lot of these are kind of anti-woke shitheads complaining about it, just to, want to give those casting choices a chance and look forward to the movie all the more because of that, just to be kind of contrarian to them because they suck. But overall, yeah, I'm just looking forward to it. It's one of the few that I'm going to make a point to actually go see in the theater, just 'cause I'm curious how it turns out. And I guess maybe I'll let people know what I think afterwards, but, maybe in a video or something. What's your opinion on characters in the "you missed the point by idolizing them" category? People like Rick from Rick and Morty, or Homelander, or the Joker, where certain people tend to not understand that the characters are warnings and not ideals to strive for. Yeah, I would say that this is definitely a problem. There's also Eren Yeager from Attack on Titan. Fight Club, I think, is a big one. Something people see as aspirational instead of as satire or a warning. And yeah, obviously, I don't like that people see these characters this way and look up to them. It's really hard to make something a warning or make kind of I don't know if an anti-hero is the right word, but make a character in a show that you're supposed to think about in a complicated way and see negatively without the wrong people thinking, boy, this guy's cool and wanting to be like them. And I think the core problem is that the character flaws that these characters are supposed to represent, they're just going to appeal to people with those same character flaws, and those people are going to miss the point. And so I guess when you say, what is your opinion on this? It's really hard to know where to go beyond that sucks, except possibly to go to the question of whether we should be depicting characters like these. And, because people tend to misunderstand these characters, should we just try to avoid them so that they don't have these rallying points in popular culture? But I tend to fall behind FD Signifier and his opinion on this. He did a whole video about this problem. Really great YouTuber. He's one of my favorites, though it's hard to get to watching him because he's very in depth, and so it feels like homework watching him sometimes. But he just said, those people are going to misunderstand what they're going to misunderstand, and you can't stop them from doing that. So if the rest of us are going to get something from these characters, either in terms of entertainment or, some kind of cultural lesson that we can all learn together, then yeah, let's just do it. Those kinds of people are going to misunderstand basically anything. I don't think that the people who rally behind these characters wouldn't be how they are otherwise. These characters aren't giving them their traits. So are we as a culture going to pump the brakes on literary nuance? Calling this literary nuance might sound a little pretentious, but you know what I mean. On nuanced characters who help us learn things about ourselves and about certain types of personality traits. Are we going to just jettison all that because a few dumbasses misunderstand the point? I would say not. So, I have two different opinions here. One, that the whole thing's unfortunate. Two, that I think we should just keep plodding along and trying to make good use of characters like these and let people who don't get it just keep not getting it. I don't know what else to do with that. So a little hike picture break. This is one I took of Eagle River. I can walk to this path literally just from my house. I walk through a neighborhood a little bit and then down a path. And so there's this. You'll notice the leaning tree. There's lots of leaning trees because the river has eroded the shore over time. And so you got a lot of big sandy hills and trees leaning over. And same area. Here's just, I guess, another picture of the river. And here's one where I was walking in town in Anchorage, actually. There's some walking paths there. And so I'll just do that after work sometimes. There was a moose just right there close. You can see his hair up on his neck a little bit like that. That's kind of nerve wracking. It means they're a little agitated, but I just walked right on past. Also bumped into a black bear a couple days ago. That was a little unnerving. Didn't bump into it as in actually touched it, of course, but it was maybe 50-ish feet away. I'm walking through some thick brush, and so I wasn't watching closely enough. And I look up, and there's a bear just on all fours staring at me. And I'm like, oh. So I talked to him kind of, gently and firmly and backed away. And he just kind of plopped down and started chewing on something. Looked like he was trying to chew up berries or something, or just chewing on a stick. I don't know. It was kind of cute, but boy, that was scary. What becomes of modern Christianity as a result of Trumpism? Wow. So this is a big one to kick off. Now, at this point, I'm on my main channel's questions. And I'm not saying this to mock YouTube Punk, a great person. I see him around quite a bit. But yeah, this is a lot to bite off. And I've thought about this some, and there are a couple different aspects to it. First off, modern Christianity is not really a crystallized thing. I think that probably goes without saying. But it helps to remind us of that Christianity, like most other cultural phenomena, is an ever-evolving thing. It's not crystallized, so there is no single modern Christianity. It's something different now than it was 10, 20, certainly 50 to 100 years ago, and it will continue being different. Now, with Trumpism, I think we're seeing kind of an accelerated shift. And so what does that look like? Hard to predict. I'm not an expert on this. I'm not a sociologist or religionologist or whatever. But I would say, broadly speaking, I see a couple things happening. And I think it's going to be centered around a divide in Christians. I see a lot of people becoming leery of the faith, or not of the faith itself, but leery of evangelicalism, and maybe letting their more moderate side come out. There are a lot of Christians I know who are more comfortable talking to me as a leftist and a non-believer than they are people within their own church, just because this infection of Trumpism, they're starting to see a side come out of the religion that they're pretty nervous about. And I guess one question is, why do they see that? Is this just a radicalization of Christianity coming from the outside and infecting people, kind of like a zombie virus, and they don't like that? Or is this something that is kind of been, lingering within Christianity for a long time? That's one thing I've struggled with. Is it really something new? Or as I look back through my childhood, is it something that has just always been there and now has just become emboldened and started to get louder? Or maybe I just hear it differently now that I'm on the other side of the fence. And I think it's kind of a mix. But whatever it is, I think a lot of people, as this gets louder and more pronounced and just more hateful and gets more of a position in society where it can actually act on its ugly instincts that it's been kind of yelling and screaming about, a lot of Christians are tending to moderate and question just what this religion has been the whole time. And so I see a very big moderating influence on a lot of other people. And it might lead some to deconstruct, either just to become less fundamentalist in their belief, or maybe just drift away from the faith. I don't know. And that's one side of it. On the other side, obviously, there's just going to be more of a radicalizing influence. So Trumpism and just the hyper-fundamentalist, hyper-patriotic, nationalistic, to be honest, fascist side of this, is going to be a draw to a lot of people. And so, yeah, I just see a big, giant divide. Essentially, I think Trumpism is putting a giant magnifying glass over Christianity. It's showing people things that are there in greater detail and in ways they can't ignore. Some people are going to respond to that by moderating and drifting away and just recoiling in horror. It's going to cause other people to rally behind it. So it's kind of separating the wheat and the chaff, whichever one you think either side is. There's going to be some trying times ahead. And, it's not necessarily just Trumpism. I alluded to before that there are a lot of thoughts and attitudes in the church that were already there that we're just seeing rise to the surface. But a lot of this, I think more than a Trump thing, is people have talked about Project 2025 and the Heritage Foundation and stuff like this. A lot of this is Christian movements dating back at least the moral majority, just trying to execute a plan to make us more theocratic and change the nature of what our government is and how it interacts with us and how it tries to bleed down into society. And so as that comes to fruition, there's going to be a lot of things changing for a lot of us, including the church. And I don't know all the parts to that, but the big thing I see is a divide, and who wins in that divide in terms of shaping society and shaping what the church is going to be like, I don't really know. I do think most of society is more progressive and tolerant than that really extreme side of this equation. But there's also an appeal there that really gets at people, and those are going to tug back and forth both ways, along with the general power dynamic. So I hope I gave some reasonable answer to that question. Explain how you are able to handle and remain strong facing some personal, negative, and abusive comments on social media. Yeah, I guess when you do YouTube, you have to have kind of a thick skin. One thing that helps is it's way easier to absorb comments directed at you than it is other people. I think if any of my family members or anybody I loved were doing this, I would take the comments a lot harder. But I don't know. You develop a thick skin. Sometimes when you just pick up your phone and you're already busy or having a long day or you're tired and you see a negative comment, that can just like be a downer for your mood. But for the most part, I think you just get used to it. A lot of my comments obviously are going to be from religious people or conservative people who are just lashing out at me because of that. And I can easily compartmentalize that as them wrestling with the idea that anybody believes differently from them and basically just lashing out because they have very, stringent ideas and they get offended on behalf of those whenever anybody questions them. So that's easy to set aside. What is harder is comments about my personal presentation, how I talk, how I sit and stuff like that. People say that I slouch or lean forward a little bit. I don't know that I consciously do that, but it's just something about how I position myself, I guess, when I'm doing this. And when my script reading voice can be a little funny, I know I trip over my words some. That can be hard to hear sometimes, but I've heard it so much that I've just absorbed it into my understanding of who I am and how people see me, and I just roll with it. You get more comfortable in your skin with age, I think. And with YouTube, it just becomes stuff you get used to hearing, and eventually it all sounds the same, which helps. So I guess there's different ways I deal with the different parts of that, but mostly it's just becoming comfortable with yourself. If you can't do that, then YouTube is definitely not for you, because boy, people just come up and say the things that everybody's probably thinking about you. They just blurt it out loud and just really let you have it. All right. Favorite biblical character. So that's a quick, straightforward question, isn't it? But it feels a little complicated when I actually think about how to answer it. Obviously, this is probably being addressed to me as an open atheist. And there are a couple ways that an atheist might answer this. One is to be kind of ironic and say like the devil or something like that. The other might be to struggle with whether they like any characters because I'm an atheist and I don't like the Bible. Or to be, rise above that and be generous and actually explain, as a work of literature, I like this character because blah, 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 blah. And I want to just, with all those possibilities out there, just give a real answer that shows who I am. And that feels a little difficult. As much as I want to be the type that acknowledges that the Bible is okay as literature, and I don't hate it just because of how it's used as a fundamentalist text in our society, I tend to find a lot of the stories and a lot of the characters to be somewhat uninteresting, partly because where the Bible actually has stories versus like instructions and prophecies and stuff like that, they tend to be very short in terms of length, short on details, and generally didactic. So the point is to tell us something about obeying God And a lot of the characters are admired for their ability to like just enforce certain cultural norms that society wanted enforced on behalf of God. And that makes it really hard for me to find characters admirable or interesting. Some of the stories I like more are the ones that are a little bit more expanded. So, the story of Joseph feels just like a breath of fresh air in the middle of Genesis, because all of a sudden you go from these just short snippets to this long novel length story with kind of satisfying twists and turns and everything. But I don't really like Joseph much as a character. I think he's kind of a know-it-all, and I just don't like him much. Characters I do like, I think, are ones where their humanity shows through a little bit. So instead of just giving one character, maybe there's a cop-out, I'm going to talk about a couple that I think I like more than some of the others. I would say Job and Jonah are a couple that I think are kind of interesting because they rise above that simple didactic enforcing the norms and lessons of the Bible thing. Job, because obviously he doubts God and asks a lot of questions. And, the way God steps down and says, hey, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? I'm bigger and better than you and stronger than you and all this stuff, and just shut up and don't answer questions. The conclusion is kind of dumb. And the fact that he like kills his family and says, but it's all cool because I gave you a new family, that just feels really crass and evil and weird. But just the fact that Job actually does wrestle with these questions on an emotional level and tries to come to terms with who God is, I think that makes him kind of an interesting character, even if the conclusions are kind of garbage. Same with Jonah. I think a lot of people misunderstand that story, or at least emphasize the wrong part of it. If you heard about the story of Jonah, especially growing up from childhood, the main thing you're going to know about it, I think, is that, God wanted him to go speak to the Ninevites and he was scared, so he tried to run away. And then he got swallowed by the whale and spit back up and then realized, oh, I'd better obey. And yeah, that's part of it. But this is where people just like the didactic part of the Bible and like to teach the lesson about obedience and stuff. That wasn't really the concluding point of the story. Yeah, you want to teach kids about obedience and everything, I guess, if you're a fundamentalist Christian. Just obey God, do what he says. But in the end, after that, his thing was he didn't want to preach to the Ninevites, not because he was afraid of them, but because he didn't want them to come to repentance. Something in him wanted to see his enemies destroyed. And he knew if he preached to them, God might forgive them and then they'd be free despite all the things they'd done. So I guess I would see Job as kind of an Achilles, or maybe to a lesser extent a Gilgamesh, somebody who had to step outside themselves and their emotional reactions to things they've been through, not seek revenge, not try to lash out because of hurt that they've been caused, certainly not try to get revenge on those who you feel like you've wronged, but you got to end that cycle at some point and allow people a chance to become better, even if they're your enemies. That seems like the point of the Job story more than the obey God and don't get swallowed by a whale thing. And I kind of like that. It's a rough-hewn version of that story. It isn't as, I don't think, poetic and philosophical as some of the other iterations of it. It seems maybe like, the Hebrews were kind of just copying that format. But the fact that they even had the inclination to notice that theme and try to pursue it, I kind of like. And so it makes Jonah a more interesting character than some of the others. I'd also say maybe King David to some extent. Yeah, he was kind of rough sometimes, but I like the fact that he wrestled with a lot of his personal failings in a way that just felt more human than a lot of other characters. And even though everything was directed toward obeying God, something about it also seemed integrated in just being a better king and person and father. And I don't know, something about the humanity of that coming through in a more developed character just hit right with me. And then Peter might be another one. I always liked his just gung-ho attitude. Yeah, he was a follower of Jesus. If you see that story for what it is, Jesus and his disciples are basically just like an apocalyptic cult, just taking things at face value for just kind of weirdly credulous reasons. Playing that I Am Jesus Christ game just really illustrates what that would have been like if you saw it in real life and just how weird it is. But I just like how, Peter's just all in. He really tries his best. He's really enthusiastic, and something about the fact that he tends to take that in the wrong direction and get enthusiastic for the wrong things just makes him kind of appealing and adorable as a character. A couple more hiking pictures. Here's Ptarmigan Trail. You walk up some switchbacks and you can see the inlet, so it's a pretty good little view here. And then here's a valley you go to. It's a lot of uphill walking for this one, but this valley is really pretty, and walking on level ground there in this area is kind of the reward for going up. And then finally, probably my favorite hike was I did part of Crow Pass. This is Echo Bend. It's about 3 miles in. So pretty cool view here. A lot of people like to see it. But I went a little further and did some switchbacks up some boulders, and there's some really great views of the river up there. So it was really nice. It was kind of almost, I'd say, a transcendent experience in a I don't believe in God way. But yeah, I have a lot of fun doing these hikes. Hope you enjoyed them. I think this is all of those. We'll just be back to questions now. You seem to be a keen observer of popular culture. Well, thank you. I'm fascinated and horrified by how a large chunk of the U.S. can find themselves anti-fascist. And so by using this double negative, I'm sure we're meaning just fascist. Is this all Fox News repetition? Isn't Hollywood supposed to be leftist? What are those people watching? Is it just very eroded education, profound parochialism? So yeah, there are a lot of aspects to this, and a lot of that is reflected in the fact that there are a lot of angles this question kind of goes for. I think the short answer is fascism just exists for a reason, and that's that it appeals to something in people about their sense of national identity and what they're entitled to. It very easily blames everything on other forces than yourself. And it does this in terms of a grand conspiracy, which I think people find just kind of satisfying. Outsiders and immigrants, people who look and talk and act different than you, they come over the border and bring problems from the outside. It simplifies what actual problems are. Social problems don't arise just naturally within society. We don't need to work on making society a better place. All you have to do is drive out those dirty invaders who are coming in and being gross and brown and wrecking your country. There's an easy and also satisfying self-righteous solution that if you can tell yourself that solves all your problems, I could see how you'd be drawn to that. And also, it's not just the outsiders, it's the traitors from within. So dirty leftists like me, you're seeing things in terms of whether they're in your country or out. You're seeing an other who you can put all your problems on. And it just creates this very easy black-white divide between you and other people and makes stomping somebody else out the solution to all your problems. I don't know. It's really hard because, the worst thing about MAGA and Trumpism is not just that he and those around him are in power, but it's the number of people who you see celebrating that and being okay with it. You like to think that the people around you are decent and intelligent, and in many ways they are, but how do you square that with the fact that this appeals to them? That's really hard. That's what I wrestle with, and maybe that's what you're wrestling with in asking this question. Knowing how these dynamics work, knowing what about fascism appeals to people and always will in certain maybe education levels and just in certain times in history, you can know that on paper, intellectually, but squaring that with what you want to think people around you are and what they seem to be, and recognizing that people and maybe in many ways respect and love can turn to this. I think that's more of a visceral and emotional problem than an intellectual one. So I don't know really how to answer that part of it other than to the best of your ability, you need to find a way to stand for what's important, stand up to those people for what's important, but also recognize that in many cases, they are generally decent people who are taken in by bad rhetoric. And even that gets muddy because I think there are parts of letting fascist and MAGA type rhetoric appeal to you that is a reflection on somebody's character. But we all have a tendency to want to other people, and blame problems on others. And so to just function alongside other people, you have to recognize that whether they're a family member or a coworker or whatever, they can function as good people and have positive interactions with you and make at least a certain sphere a better place alongside you if you're willing to work with them, but also recognize that you got to draw a line and point out that certain things aren't okay. So I guess I got off track going from how this happens on an intellectual level to how you cope with it, but I think that is just a kind of an inherent part of this question. As far as, is it Fox News repetition? That's part of it. Just malicious forces repeating this over and over again helps, but I think there's just a core idea that's appealing to. And that repetition doesn't work, I think, just because it's repetition. I think it's because it repeats things and legitimizes things with the trappings of news programming that people already tend to think and just find satisfying. So Hollywood's supposed to be leftist. I would say, yeah, within certain spheres, there are a lot of leftists in Hollywood, but there are more right-wing leaning people than you might think. And also, the farther you get up, the more people are interested in money, so the actual power brokers are probably going to lean more right than you might think. And is it eroded education and parochialism? That all contributes, But again, I think I'm going to get repetitious here. A lot of this stuff, again, is just bad education, bad information, bad news sources. They all contribute to it. But I think at its core, there is just a mindset that appeals to people. And if a populace can tap into that, then yeah, they're going to make our country a worse place and affect the mindset of people for the worst. All right, here's a straightforward and short question. Why? That's probably the shortest question a person can ask, just even hypothetically in terms of number of words and letters. So not sure exactly what you mean, but considering question is in response to me saying I'm doing a question answering video, I think I explained this at the beginning, but I just enjoy taking questions from people and answering them. And I feel like it's just a prompt to let certain parts of me come out. So I just enjoy it and it's fun. And I think other people tend to enjoy it too. So there you go. All right, let's do this. Thoughts on objective morality, thoughts on AI conquering everything, thoughts on pineapple on pizza. So 3-parter here, I guess. Objective morality. I hate that term, but I don't blame you for bringing it up. I just find the term a little bit problematic. It's almost always brought up in terms of religious apologetics, saying that morality is objective with God and subjective without God. I think that's entirely untrue. My short answer when people say, is morality objective, especially when I know it's being asked in that context, is just to say, if morality is objective, whatever you think that means, it's objective with or without God. And if it's subjective, whatever that means to you, it's subjective with or without God. However you conceptualize morality, adding another being into the mix, and even if you give it power and wisdom and stuff like that, that doesn't change the nature of morality. Throwing a God in, yeah, that God could enforce a moral code. People could think that it's the ultimate decider because it knows more. But really, all it's doing is having more insight into and being able to better enforce morals that might be justified or not. And if it's able to understand those morals because of its wisdom, it's just understanding something that exists on its own terms, independent of the God anyway. But I guess I would say if we're to set aside the God thing, because who knows if that's any of the point you're trying to get at, if we're to set that aside and just look at morality by itself, what does the word objective mean? It means something that basically people are going to agree on because it's not up for question for the most part. This is rough-hewn language, but I'm using language that's a little rough and non-technical just to get to the core of what we actually mean when we use the word. So I could say, objectively speaking, this is a red cup and it's sitting on my desk. That is just an objective fact. It's really hard to contend that. I could show it to you and we would both just have to agree. And what makes it objective is there are just a set of facts, assuming we're not being pedantic about language, that we can form an agreement on and start further conversation on. If you wanted to argue whether it was red and stuff like that, there might be a little subjective in the terminology and how we label a color or whatever. But you know what I mean. Now, if I were to say this red cup is nice or this red cup is pretty, that would be a little more subjective, right? And so that's a difference, something that's a matter of preference or taste versus something that you can just point to as a fact. So with morality, are there facts like that you can point to? Probably not in the same way, but there is a certain kind of agreement that we can come to as a species, I think, that, murdering people, generally harming people, taking things from people, just basically anything that's unjust. Most of us can agree that anything that negatively affects the well-being of another person for no justified reason, and what justified is and isn't can be a little complicated, but we can dig down to the details on that. Most of us will agree that that's not okay. Is it objective in the sense that we can point to it? No. Is it objective in the sense that our species, or is it subjective in the sense that our species maybe agrees on that for subjective reasons? Maybe, I guess. But our species does tend to agree on that, except for sociopaths and, other outliers. And so that agreement that, you shouldn't harm other people, that's something that most groups of people sitting around in a circle can agree on as a starting point, as surely as we can agree on this red cup is sitting on a desk. I would compare it to, let's just say that the question, is this cup nice, is subjective. What if this cup was like, I don't know, all just dirty and rotten and covered in mold and poop and stuff like that? Most of us would say that cup is nasty. Is nasty and objective term. Can we point to it and measure it? No, but pretty universally across our species, we would agree to that. And I'd say that that's, in that sense, I know it's not technically objective, but in that sense, it's objective in the sense that, we would achieve broad, pretty much universal consensus that that's a gross thing. Same thing for certain kinds of harm that you do to people. We have a consensus across humanity, however we got it, that doing certain things to people is bad, and we build most of our morals on that consensus. And so in that sense, yeah, I'd say morality could be said to be objective. In a philosophical sense, probably not. There are a lot of judgment calls and cultural baggage and stuff like that that go into morality. But for the most part, I would say that functionally there is an objectivity there that just saves us from the kind of just utter subjectivity that apologists like to say results from God not existing. Thoughts on AI conquering everything? I don't know a whole lot about AI. Not a big fan for a lot of reasons, but I don't know that it's going to conquer everything. Right now, as far as I know, it's more of a predictive text model than actual thought. But again, I'm not an expert on that. I think like most technology, it's going to be a tool, and it's going to be less that the AI itself conquers us and more that certain, business forces use it against us. And I'm more concerned about it being a tool for avoiding, paying labor and stuff like that. So computers only do what you want them to do or program them to do. They're not going to develop a certain consciousness where they develop desires, opposite of their programming. And when people write stories like that, where a robot just wants to conquer because it wants power or it wants wealth or whatever, they're projecting human instincts onto that computer, where a computer is just going to have the instincts you program into it. So unless, for example, like HAL in 2001, A Space Odyssey, they programmed it with too high a sense of personal preservation, I don't think a computer is going to turn on people. I'm more concerned about what people do. Thoughts on pineapple on pizza? Just absolutely disgusting. And I would say that's an objective fact. Why would you do that? That's gross. So, okay, I'll qualify that. Chunks of pineapple, nasty. And that's partly probably just me with pineapple. I don't like eating pieces of pineapple. I don't like the texture of it, but I like pineapple juice. That might be part of it beyond just the brazen, disgusting fact that you're putting pieces of fruit on a pizza. However, a spicy pizza with little bits of crushed pineapple sprinkled on it, that little bit of sweetness and citrus in there can actually be good. So I guess that moderates my answer to that question just a little bit. Assuming you came out as non-believing to your family, what factors were involved in that decision and how did it go for you? I think the cons continue to outweigh the pros for me, but it is something I think about. So this is a very good question. And, coming out to people as non-believing, especially to family, is something I would be very careful with. Take your time with it. Make sure you're in a good place to where doing that is safe. You're not going to destroy relationships. Once you say it, you can't take it back unless you want to pretend to, repent and come back to the faith. And that's just crossing a whole other bridge there. But yeah, is this going to affect where you're living, your financial security? I hate to say to pretend for crass reasons like that, but you do need to take your personal safety into account. Are the people around you going to get abusive to you? Are you going to wreck relationships with people who just aren't ready to hear this, who you love and otherwise get along with? You don't want to throw that all out there. My situation was different probably than a lot of people are asking this question because I was a bit older when I came out as non-believing. I was close to 40, I think, when I really considered the fact that I didn't believe. Doubts lingered to the point that I was probably a mostly non-believing Christian for years before then. And that came and went in waves. I wouldn't say that I insincerely just kept attending church and acting like a believer, but doubt is just kind of muddy sometimes. And it's really hard to tell when you actually stop believing. But anyway, when I actually acknowledged I didn't believe, I held on to it for a little while. I don't remember exactly how long. But honestly, I was more concerned about, at my age, my kids than about other family members, like, parents and stuff like that. And so the factors that fit into it, I went to church for quite a while after I knew I was a non-believer, largely for the sake of my kids. And I just didn't want to yank the rug out from under them, or just me in general. You don't want to do things you can't take back if you're not sure that it's the right time. But it was when I started realizing that if I kept attending church, it would just get weird. and I was being disrespectful to that church by showing up. My non-belief had become so clear for so long that it just wasn't tenable. I sat down with my kids and just had the talk with them about it. It was kind of hard. It was one of the harder things I've done, but it was at the point where it had to be done by then. I think we've all weathered it. Telling other people, beyond my kids, I think most people pretty much knew because of things I was posting on social media. I wasn't saying God didn't exist, but there are ways where, I posted a lot of progressive things and a lot of things that maybe pushed the envelope of what a Christian would say. And so I think most people knew already. So that's my story. But for yours, if you think the cons continue to outweigh the pros, or even if you think there are cons, this isn't a pure plus and minus. And if the pluses get a little better than the minuses, you just go for it. I would say think a lot about the minuses and make sure you're just ready to let go of that and be on that journey. Because once you do, it's done. Uh, you- I'm probably speaking too negatively about it. There's also a lot of trouble that can come from just letting it build up inside you and not really being who you are. So that is important. You don't want to ignore that. But as long as you can deal with that, just be careful. Are you a Mystery Science Theater 3000/Riff Tracks fan? And if so, what are some of your favorites? So I am a Mystery Science Theater fan. I don't know so much about Riff Tracks. I'm vaguely aware, I think, that they play jokes about a movie in time and then you can just watch it as you watch the movie. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But yeah, I get the concept and I used to enjoy it. I don't know that I don't enjoy it now. I just haven't been into it in a while. Mystery Science Theater, when I was in college, we really liked watching those. And they actually did a live show. I think it was when Mike was the character on it. Mike came and did a presentation at my college. It was like a little touring thing. And so he talked about what the show was like. They brought out a couple of the puppets and you could see them and stuff. So that was pretty cool. Some of my favorites, I think Writing with Death was a fun one. One of the funniest times watching a Mystery Science Theater movie was that. I don't know if it's the quality of it or if it's just with all these things. I think it's just the people you're watching with and the mood you were in and the time you had. Also, I like Mitchell. That was pretty funny. It's Jodan Baker, I think is his name. He plays a detective who's just a total slob. And it's trying to make him this kind of gross anti-hero, but he's just so gross, it just becomes funny. And so those are a couple that I liked. On a side note, why I don't really get into them now, I think partly it's just time. Maybe the gag gets old after a while, but partly I think it's time. And partly I think this is something where they filled a niche that the internet fills now in just different ways. You can just get a lot more of those jokes in just YouTube videos that riff on movies or in just little short snippets without actually sitting down and watching a whole thing. So maybe this is just where the internet and our attention span moved us along in ways that maybe ruined things. What kind of music and bands do you like? What kind of literature do you like? And is there a book you'd recommend? What do you do for a living? Music and bands, I think I talked about already with the first question. Literature, anytime somebody asks me my favorite of anything, it's just really hard to pick because it depends a lot on what mood I'm in. And I just develop a body of things that I like in different times for different reasons. I've liked a lot of science fiction over time, like Isaac Asimov and Ray Bradbury and people like that. Asimov is more cold and calculated and interesting. Ray Bradbury has this kind of more emotional punch to his stories. I think especially when you read him, if you can ever listen to Ray Bradbury read books on tape, he just has this kind of emphasis to how he speaks that adds a whole other punch to his stories. I mean, there's just such a big body of literature out there that's just great in terms of the American classics, like Great Gatsby and Steinbeck novels and everything like that. So there's just so much to choose. It's really hard to tell, and a lot depends on the mood I'm in. Something that's accessible to people that might be more interesting than they think is World War Z is one I've read within the last few years. And it's not at all like the movie. I think each chapter is its short, self-contained story about how different people responded to it. And so it's nothing super profound. It's an easy read and it's fun, but it's just kind of an interesting window into how people in society respond to disasters. The zombies are just kind of a contrivance just to give us a disaster to show people responding to that's more interesting than an earthquake or something. But it just shows how people respond to things, just what human nature's like, and then how society recovers and everything. So I don't know. That's one if you want something just to go read that's accessible and easy. Go ahead and try that one. What do you do for a living? I work for a telecommunications company up here, and I work in supply chain, which sounds pretty boring, but it's super interesting. I do a few things in there. I have a small team that I kind of de facto lead, and they're all great. I love working with them all, so I really enjoy my job. And I do a lot of different things like process improvement and documentation, along with daily operations. And I guess I'm a little bit like the Bobs, where I try to, on an informal basis, try to figure out, what's good uses of people's time and stuff like that. So maybe I can be a little bit of an asshole in that way. But yeah, I do I do a whole lot of things, and it's pretty interesting and fun. All right, before God taught the Hebrews how to dig holes in Deuteronomy 23:13, were they just dropping dookies where they stood? Do vegan Catholics just skip the Eucharist? That second one is kind of an interesting question, I guess. I don't know. I guess you'd have to ask a Catholic vegan, and it probably depends person by person. Uh, Maybe it depends partly on how literally they take the idea of transubstantiation. If a vegan's issue with eating meat is that it's an animal has to die for it and be murdered, they probably don't have that hang up with communion. But yeah, if you just don't want meat in your stomach and you think transubstantiation literally turns the Eucharist into the body and blood of Christ, that might be a hang up for you. So I don't know, if you're a Catholic vegan, and I think that's probably an overlap that we don't have a lot of watching right now, that'd be a pretty big coincidence. Let us know in the comments. I'd be curious to hear about that. And yeah, I don't know what to do other than to locate a Catholic vegan and see what they think about this. Maybe I'll Google it. The one about the Hebrews, yeah, did they just take dumps everywhere before God told them to dig a hole? I think the point of this question is just kind of a riff on the fact that Deuteronomy 23:13 tells the Hebrews when you need to go take a shit, basically. Doesn't use those exact words, but find a designated space outside the camp, take tools with you to dig, and then, bury it and do it all in one spot, which I guess is pretty good advice. I can understand the snark in this question, but to be fair to Deuteronomy, which is something I'm not generally inclined to do, it might not be that they thought that they would just be shitting outside their doors, which maybe, I don't know. But it doesn't have to be that. It could just be giving them advice to just, find one spot and bury it and make sure it's all in one place. But that's still just such basic common sense advice. Do you really need a book of the Bible to tell you that? And if this advice, if this advice was being passed around the Hebrew nation, the fact that it's codified and remained in Scripture for all these years indicates that it's, profound wisdom that God thought needed to be passed down. And that's sure kind of weird, isn't it? So while I don't think it's implying that people didn't know where to poop until they got this, it is kind of interesting that the Bible thought that was worth putting in there. And like a lot of other health codes and things in the Bible that a lot of Christians point to and say, wow, this just proves the Bible was divine, because how would they know this? Or say, the blood and water coming out of Jesus, which pericardial effusion probably would not produce enough water to be visible. But even if it did, does that mean that it's supernatural knowledge, or does it mean that, somebody who wrote that story had seen someone get stabbed before? It's amazing the pass Christians give the Bible. And I don't know, there's almost a certain amount of, I don't know if intellectual laziness is the right word, but not understanding the point of intellectual exploration and how you observe things and come up with an idea. You lose your sense of perspective on that when you think the Bible is just awesome because it told you to find one spot and bury your shit in it. So yeah, I don't know. They probably didn't do that. But yeah, I guess I get where you're going with this question, and I enjoyed it. Top 5 least favorite governments, modern. Oh boy, this is a hard one. I have trouble ranking stuff like this. There's so many totalitarian regimes out there, so many theocracies. It could be an easy, edgy thing for me to say the United States, but as bad as things are here, there are so many that are just way worse. North Korea probably is a really easy, accessible number 1 for a lot of people. I would say Iran, Saudi Arabia, most of those Middle Eastern theocracies, especially the harder they go toward just absolute, religious dominionism. I would say those ones are probably among some of my least favorites. But there are so many just hardcore regimes that maybe don't appear in the news and you don't hear a lot about, even though it would just be horrible to live there. So to me, it's hard to come up with a list. I would say the United States and Russia are two of my least favorites, just in terms of just how bad the governments have gotten and how destabilizing they are, considering the amount of power they can project across the world. Russia is obviously straight up just a mafia state at this point. The United States is starting to behave a little more like a totalitarian regime. One social media thing I've seen that puts this into perspective is that the world isn't just distrusting Trump because he's crazy. It's distrusting the United States because we allowed this to happen and caused it to happen. And there are just some safeguards clearly that aren't in place in our country, and a lot of people in power who are just willing to let this totally wild thing happen. So it's a complex question. I would say, some like North Korea and Middle Eastern regimes in terms of just the absolute horror of the government, probably more like the United States and Russia in terms of who is headed in that direction and is able to do the largest scale bad in the world. Pancakes or waffles? Boy, this is a hard one. You would think that there would just be an answer to this question, but I think I'd maybe lean toward waffles, but it depends so much on the mood I'm in. Pancakes, if they're done right, can just be amazing. If they're, depending on the mood I'm in, if they're just nice and fluffy, or if you get them in some pretty good oil and crisp them up really good along the edges, boy, that sure is amazing. I've heard those called black people pancakes, which is kind of strange, especially considering that a family member of mine who used to make them the most was just very racist. I guess that's kind of how that goes though, huh? So yeah, it just depends on the mood I'm in. I maybe lean toward waffles, but here, if I want to give a better answer and, just let who I am come out in this question. One thing, if you haven't tried it, that my son and I used to do when he was younger and he was into cooking with me a lot, we'd make breakfast together before he went to school, is waffled French toast. So we would make French toast and then we would jam it onto the waffle maker. And that was just super good. It was really crispy and it was just quite an invention. And so maybe if he gets inclined to be like that again, he's a teenager, so he's doing more of his own stuff now. But maybe we'll open a waffled French toast restaurant. And if anybody else does this after watching this video, I'll know you stole my idea and I will just come for you and sue you. And with that, that's the end of the questions. I hope you enjoyed these. I'm sorry for my voice. My sinuses are a little funky right now, and that might be coming through in how I sound. But hopefully you had fun with this. And until next time, have a good day, everybody.